We're going to welcome now Dr. Sonia Klinsky to do her presentation. Sonia, we are going to stop our screen sharing at our end and allow you to share your screen because I think you're running your own slides, and I'll let you do that while I read off your bio here for everyone. So Dr. Klinsky is an associate professor at the School of Sustainability at Arizona State University. For more than 15 years, her work has explored the justice dilemma presented by climate change and climate change policies design at multiple scales. Her work is motivated by a desire to constructively contribute to the efforts that address the challenges of justice in a resource-contained world. Specifically, she is focused on understanding how individuals, organizations, and jurisdictions are attempting to navigate the personal and policy dilemmas that emerge from the juxtaposition of systemic justice issues and climate change. People may be wondering why we invited Sonia to join us today, but she has lots of local roots in Grey County, having been born and raised here before heading off for schooling. So we are very pleased that she is able to join us today. And I will turn it over to you now, Sonia. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me and see my slides. Indeed, I am actually, thanks to the magic of Zoom, I am Zooming from Feversham. So I am a professor at Arizona State University, but I live in Feversham, Ontario, so just a little ways outside of Owen Sound. So it's lovely to be here. Now, I want to back up a little bit. I really enjoyed the last presentation because it was so specific and so concrete. And one of the great challenges in climate change is to figure out how do we find ourselves in this huge megalith of an issue. And one way is to focus on specific concretes. And I'm going to invite all of you to take a step back and try to figure out where you fit into this really big, messy issue. I know you're going to be having sort of several days of conversation about this. And unfortunately, much of it may not make you feel very good, to quote the last speaker. But one of our challenges is to actually think that through. So I'm actually going to be talking about this at a much broader level and invite you to kind of think about how to juxtapose the bigger picture with the more specific all the way through your deliberations over the next couple of days. So one thing that I have learned, I've been working on climate change since 2005. When I started, like many people, I thought of climate change as an environmental issue. However, the more I've worked in climate change, I've come to understand it as an issue of relationships. It's about how we live with other people, how we live with other entities, non-humans, but it really is about how we design our societies and how we live in them. And that makes it a much bigger conversation. It's going to touch on all aspects of our lives. And so let's delve into that a little bit more as a much broader framing approach to this issue. But before we do this, I do think it's important to have a tiny little primer on what we're really talking about with climate change. And again, some of this came up before, but I do want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So one of the conversations I often get is, well, isn't climate change part of our natural space? And to some extent, yes, right? So let's remind ourselves how climate change works. We have the planet, it's floating out there in outer space. Sun comes in, light comes in from the sun as heat. It reflects off the earth and goes back into outer space. Now, if we didn't have an atmosphere, we would be in so much trouble because all of that sun's energy would go right back into outer space and we would be an uninhabitable planet. Luckily for us, we have an atmosphere, which includes greenhouse gases, which help reflect that heat back onto the earth, which gives us the climate we now have. The problem is, of course, is that as we are increasing the number of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, that is getting thicker so that, or more reflective of heat, so that more of the heat bounces back at us. So if we didn't have a greenhouse effect to some extent, we would literally not be habitable. But what we've done is we've taken what's like a comfortable summer blanket and made it into a duvet. Now, to just highlight how rapidly this has happened and how profound the impacts of this are, let's look at this slide. Now, this slide looks at all the sort of changes in sort of the accumulation of CO2, which is the sort of the prime greenhouse gas that we're kind of concerned about, although there's some others that are very important, like methane, over the last 22,000 years. Now, the Earth is always shifting, always moving. Things are always happening on the Earth. It's a very dynamic planet. the first side of this graph shows us how much emissions have increased in the last 22,000 years. The other side of the graph shows us how much greenhouse gas emissions have emerged since 1960. In the last 60 years of Earth, we have basically put 22,000 years of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. We've effectively sped up time. When I first saw this graph, even I was startled when I realized what we had done. What this is saying is we are fundamentally changing the nature of the atmosphere. Never in the history of the geological history of the Earth have we ever seen this kind of a rapid spike. 22,000 years of emissions in 60 years. For some of you, that might be your lifetime. Now, the Earth is an incredible entity. It's always adapting. But how on earth is it supposed to adapt to this speed of change? And indeed, it is the speed of change that we are most worried about. Most of our natural systems on the planet are not designed to adapt to changes this fast. Forests, they move, but they take thousands of years to move, and they don't have highways and cities in the way. Shorelines, all of us who live near Georgian Bay know that shorelines have always moved. But what happens when they move this fast? And what happens when we have human infrastructure built on all those shorelines? What happens when we have human infrastructure built on all those riverways? What happens when we have infrastructure built in areas that are increasingly drying out, and drying out faster than we have ever seen, ever since humans started to exist in the form that we do? Now you might ask, well, where do all these emissions come from? So as Canadians, this puts us in a somewhat of a double bind. To some extent, as the last presenter pointed out, we are highly vulnerable to climate change, things like flooded basements. On the other hand, Canadians have also been at the top of the contributors to this globally. So if we look at who's actually contributed to this per person, Canadians, except for some of the countries in the Middle East because of their heavy oil production, are right at the top of the list. Per capita, Canada has much higher emissions than most of the rest of the world. If you take the United States and Canada together, cumulatively, we've contributed about 30% of all emissions of all time. The entire continent of Africa, the entire continent, has contributed 3% of emissions of all time. Now, this is an uncomfortable fact for us to have to look at. And I would invite you to stop right now for a second and just think about how this is making you feel. Are you tuning out? Are you feeling tense? Are you feeling like you don't really want to have this conversation? These are some of the emotional elements that are facing us when we deal with climate change. And we need to think about, how are we going to tackle this problem? This is largely an issue which has started in the global north, and one in which we are effectively going to have to deal with it. However, if there's a good news to this, it's this. Now, this might seem like a bizarre image to have in a conversation about climate change. For those of you who have children or grandchildren, or perhaps are secret Harry Potter fans yourself, you will recognize this image. This is from the Harry Potter movie, and it is a man who is a werewolf seeing his worst fear. The monster of a Boggart is a monster that has no natural form. A Boggart is whatever you yourself most fear. So if you feel spiders, and you look at a Boggart, you're going to see spiders. Now you might be saying, what is this random woman talking about with spiders and fears? This is what climate change does to us. I invite you to think about, what are the things that scare you the most? Is it rapid environmental change? Is it public health? Is it concerns about wildfire? Is it concerns about financial implications of having to rapidly change an economy to adapt to climate change that's happening this fast? The good news is that each of us answers this question differently. Each one of you on this call is going to answer this in a slightly different way. My biggest concern about climate change is fill in the blanks. If we were doing this in person, we could actually go around the room and ask people, when you think about climate change, Which aspect of it is the thing that you are most concerned about? And the benefit is that everyone here is going to have a different answer. This is a strength, not a disadvantage, because this problem is so multifaceted that we need absolutely everyone to bring to the table what they themselves are most concerned and most passionate about. So some of the faces of climate change are different. For some communities, the single largest threat is going to be one of wildfire. Across Canada, this is an enormous concern. We see huge drying, and this is, I'm going to get back to this in a minute. This is a really pressing issue in Ontario. Drying of forest areas. We also have an added problem. This isn't just about the environment. This is an issue around who lives in these areas. This is an issue of infrastructure loss and an issue of all of the issues around public health and mental health that comes with forest fires. We could think about climate change this way. This is an image of Barbados. I've spent many, many years going to the UN climate negotiations on climate change, where I've met people from all over the world working on this. And it's very easy for us to feel like climate change is far away. For some of the countries at those negotiations, they are facing an existential threat. By far, the most certain impact of climate change is going to be heightened sea level rise as our oceans warm and expand, and as we have massive Arctic and Antarctic melting. These populations are barely above sea level. When we're talking about climate change, we're not talking about minor alterations for some communities. We're talking about fundamental existential threat. These communities and entire countries will cease to exist. They will be underwater. Now you might say that seems really far away, but what does that mean? I think that opens up questions for all of us to think about: what kind of a world do we want? What kind of relationships should we have? How might this shape things like refugee policy? How might this shape things about how we think about our relationships to other parts of the world? Very rarely would we think about things like refugee policy from a climate lens. Or what about the public health aspects of people who come to Canada after losing not only their homes, but their countries? How are we going to deal with that? Or how are we going to deal with those of us who come from places like this, who have to deal with the loss that comes with not only having left our homes, but fundamentally losing relationships that go with it? These are the bigger issues that come up when we start talking about climate change. This was brought forth to me in an incredibly visceral way when I was at a international climate negotiation and Typhoon Haiyan hit. Typhoon Haiyan was at that point the largest typhoon to ever land in the Philippines. A year before, in exactly the middle of the climate negotiations, another massive typhoon hit the Philippines. And so there we were talking about what to do about climate change. And the chief negotiator for the Philippines, the man responsible for representing his entire country, finally broke down in tears. What were we going to do about this? He did the only thing he could think of. He went on a hunger strike for the rest of the 2-week negotiation. Now, it's easy for us to think about climate change as a distant threat. Much less easy to think about it when someone has to do something like this, to get attention on the international scene, to say, I will not eat for 2 weeks, even though I am the single most important person from my country here, because the single most important thing to do is to talk about how serious and how pressing this issue is. And so Yeb Sano went on a hunger fast for the rest of the climate negotiation. Now, I want you to pause for a second and think through all the psychological elements that come forth when we talk about climate change in this way. It can be really overwhelming. But in each of these elements, I invite you to think through, how do I relate to this issue and where are the opportunities to engage? Let's make it a little closer to home. Let's think about Ontario. So I want to mention a few of the key issues which have been documented to be at risk in Ontario. And this is being led by a whole bunch of scientists, as well as the governments of Ontario and of Canada. There's a series of forms of assessments. We've already heard quite a lot about it, but infrastructure and water management. That's both flooding, that's riverine, storm surges, things like storm drains, basements. Wildfire, huge issue, we're gonna talk about that in a minute. I wanna focus on public health a little bit, because I know that many of you are coming here from a public health conversation. Massive agricultural challenges here. Changes to livestock heat stress and reduced productivity for anyone who relies on livestock. That includes the dairy industry, as well as the beef industry, as well as things like chickens or other animals. Disease shifts, as we're seeing shifts in that. Warmer winters and snow covers. Well, for those of us who live near the Collingwood area, some serious economic implications from shifting snow cover. Imagine all of these areas in Ontario that are dependent on things like skiing. And threats to 3 species, especially fish, which for those of us who live near the Great Lakes and who rely on that area, this is a real concern. However, because in the interest of time, I want to very lightly touch on just 3 of these. I'm going to talk about very briefly about flooding, wildfire, and public health. Unfortunately, we just don't have time to go into all the rest, but I'm hoping that in the rest of your series, we will chat about this. This is an image from a ice dam flooding event that happened in 2018 in the Brampton, Waterloo, Cambridge areas. These are enormously expensive events. A single ice dam event can cost a municipality millions of dollars. And they are happening with increased frequency and indeed increased intensity. We see this across the southwestern Ontario region. In fact, across Canada and across North America, this region is one of the areas that is at highest risk of increased municipal flooding of this sort. This is what takes out bridges, this is what takes out roads, and this exactly also, by the way, is triggered to some of these other home damage events. They are incredibly expensive events. So we're talking about infrastructure here. We're not just talking about the environment. We're talking about municipal budgets, and we're talking about homeowners losing and businesses losing huge amounts of capital accumulation through the destruction of infrastructure. We also have an issue in some of our most remote communities. So across Ontario, Indigenous communities are some of the highest risk communities for some of these events. A community could easily lose some of its major infrastructure, including absolutely essential infrastructure such as water treatment, water management, and fundamental access to emergency services. So this is an issue across Ontario that has real implications for Ontarians. Forest fires are another real issue across the province. The Canadian Forest Service predicts increase in lightning strikes by about 24% in 2040 in terms of fires by lightning strikes, and about 80% by the end of the century. This is because across the major boreal forest in Ontario, we are seeing drier, hotter conditions and a decrease in the accumulated moisture in these forests. Now, again, you might say, well, those are forest fires. It's in the wilderness. It's unfortunate. But again, this is not just about the environment. We have real concerns here. We have massive potential losses, especially by Indigenous communities who tend to be in these areas. This is a forest fire about 3 years ago in Northern Ontario, and you can see it's coming right up to the community. Not only is this affecting houses, this is taking out hydro, this is taking out 911 services, this is blocking evacuation routes. This is an absolute public health concern. We also have the issue in terms of the large-scale air quality issues that this raises, and we're seeing huge amount of publications right now coming out, particularly on the long-term implications of pediatric air quality from forest fires. We're seeing sustained damage to young people as they are inhaling particulates from forest fires. So this is the kind of thing where a forest fire doesn't just happen and go away. An entire generation of young people who are exposed to those fires will have lifelong implications of that fire. And this is an absolute impact we are going to be seeing more of in Ontario. Now, I do want to pick up on this public health theme a little bit, because we are going to be having many of this conversation is, and it is sponsored by the public health. So I do want to think about this a little bit more. This is comes out of the Journal of Emergency Nursing. And it has become very apparent that the public health elements of this are absolutely pressing. The medical journal The Lancet has a climate change commission where every year they update all the literature across public health. So for those of you in the public health field, I encourage you to look at The Lancet. It's a top leading medical journal, and every single year they go through the data around public health and climate change. This is one, the Journal of Emergency Nursing has also tackled this. And we see that really the health implications of this come from multiple areas. You have an issue in changes in disease vector, everything from changing allergens, water quality impacts, extreme heat, severe weather, and air pollution. These are very, very multifaceted. I'm not going to have time to go into all of them, but for those of you here from a public health perspective, I really encourage you to look at some of these resources. They're increasingly being well documented and they're increasingly available. And like I said, the Lancet Commission is an excellent starting point. They have a fantastic commission of global doctors who are tracking this every single year. Let's just look at some of these in a little more detail. So this is the number of heat waves exposure from 1986 to 2005. This is one of the most immediate climate impacts. Now, at first, some of you might be thinking, oh, heat waves is not that relevant. However, actually, one of the areas of populations who are most at risk here are seniors and those in areas which are not equipped to deal with heat waves. So let's look at our own region. How many people actually have things like access to cooling if they needed it? One of the complications, especially in rural areas, especially in areas where heat has not traditionally been a problem, is that this raises a unique health risk which people are not prepared for. So there has been some recent studies of hospitalizations in this region, and it is suggesting that in fact hospitalizations are increasing and are tied to these heat wave events locally. Now, this raises a number of questions in terms of if people are aware of and thinking through heat-related stress. It also raises some questions about the adequacy of local public health capacities to deal with these changing threats in areas which are not traditionally attuned to thinking this through. This also, of course, has massive economic implications. We see globally sustained increases in the amount of work hours lost from productivity due to increased health. And of course, the areas of most concern are agriculture and industry. Now, again, when we think about our area, we think about a rural area in which ag continues to be a real concern. These are immediate life challenges to people who are working on the land every day, day in and day out. It seems easy to tune out to it, but these are lived experiences by our neighbors who are dependent on agriculture for their way of life. One of the other pressing areas is changes in disease vectors. Now, I admit as a skeptic, when people first started talking about changes in disease vectors because of climate change, I didn't think the change would be that serious. I have been proven wrong. This is data here where they're looking at the number of cases per 100,000 rate of Lyme disease in Ontario. We see here a massive increase in the amount of Lyme disease that's being recorded. Now, some of this may be because Lyme disease has not always been that easy to detect. However, you'll note here the change we're talking about is in a relatively short number of years, and the technology for properly diagnosing Lyme disease has not changed that much in the last 5 years. We are seeing a sustained evidence that this is spreading north and it is becoming a more pressing health concern. Again, Lyme disease can shape people's well-being for their entire lives and puts immense pressure on our public health structure. People may or may not know about these risks. There's a whole issue around public health communication. This is again why climate is a real issue in the local context. Now, as I've mentioned a number of times, and as the last speaker said, I think direct quotation was, none of this is going to make you feel good. These are not light observations. At the same time, there's an element of climate which gets systematically ignored, which is the mental health element of climate change. Across the board, we are seeing increased documentation of real mental health implications of climate change. Elements of feeling lost, feeling overwhelmed, feeling grief for what had been, what could be, worry. This was really brought home to me when I was back in the day when we were able to travel. I was at an international climate negotiation and I was Skyping in with school children in North America to let them know how global climate change negotiations work. And I was Skyping in with a class of grade 3 students in the Toronto region. And one of the little girls had a question prepared for me. And she stood there with her question written, that had flowers drawn on the corners, and it said, "Will the world be alive when I grow up?" And that question gave me a huge pause, because that is a question about mental health. That is a question about how are we dealing with grief? How are we dealing with anxiety? How are we dealing with the fact that the world is fundamentally changing? The world will not look the same for that girl in grade 3 as it does now. Some of the systems that we depend on now and take for granted will not be functioning when she is alive, grown up. So yes, the world will be alive, but the world will look fundamentally different. And so dealing with this mental health issue is a pressing concern, both because of the immediate loss element of it. And of course, this is even worse for people whose fundamental neighborhoods, areas are going to be changed. The Australian psychologist and philosopher Glenn Albrecht came up with the word solastalgia. Solastalgia is that sense of loss when the area you grew up in, or the place you call home, no longer looks like the way it did. You are home, and yet you are somehow displaced from home because it's lost some elements. Perhaps the forests don't look the same. Perhaps the streams don't run the same way. Perhaps the species you were used to enjoy no longer exist. I also bring up the mental health element because we tend to use avoidance techniques to help us deal with climate change. We decide to disconnect. We decide not to face our grief. We decide not to think about elements that make us uncomfortable. We decide it's easier to say there's nothing can be done. It's easier to say it's somebody else's issue. It's easier to say it's not relevant for our community. It's easier to say the changes are too big. Those are your own psychological processes which are defending you from having to tackle this issue. And one of the ways we can deal with that is to think through why and how we emotionally respond to this issue, and how that allows us to actually open up and lean into it rather than try to avoid it. So one of the areas I want to bring up, and I know we are short on time because so I'm trying to keep my presentation short as well, but I do think this is an incredibly important illustration. This is a complicated figure, but I think it's a super important one, especially for those of you who are in the public health realm. And by public health, I include those of you who are in counseling, any kind of social work, any kind of public outreach. One of the single most reliable findings across the community of people who are looking at climate impacts is that there is a huge difference in who feels the climate impacts. Vulnerability is tied to pre-existing inequalities. So on the one side of this diagram, you see all kinds of drivers of inequality: gender, class, ethnicity, race, age, disability. These shape who and who does not have access to resources, who faces which different kinds of impacts, and those combine to create an integrated metric of vulnerability. So there are going to be some people in your neighborhood or in your community who are more vulnerable than others. So if we go back to the flooded basement, you might have two homeowners, both of whom have a basement flood. In one of them, imagine you have a low-income family who has to rent that basement. That's their only place to live. For them, having their basement flooded is an existential issue, right? As Dr. Feltmate mentioned, we don't want to have people going onto the street. For the other one, perhaps it was a relatively wealthy couple. Perhaps they don't really use their basement. It's a rec room. Yeah, they've lost a basement, but they haven't lost their place of life. They haven't lost everything. So we can see that the exact same impact of flooded basement has actually totally different impacts on the two different groups of people, because our pre-existing vulnerabilities shape how we interact with climate change. So for those of you who are either in local government or in public health, or for those of you who are engaged in social action, we have to stop and ask ourselves some really important questions. We know that climate change does not affect everybody equally. We know that pre-existing inequalities shape who is most harmed by the same climate impact. So we have to start our assessment by asking, what inequalities currently exist in our communities? How did they get there? Do we have issues with systemic racism? Do we have issues with ongoing inequality due to loss of jobs, due to whatever has happened locally? Loss of agricultural employment? What is going on in terms of driving these inequalities? And how might these inequalities intersect with the potential risks of climate change? We see this particularly in many Indigenous populations, where already Indigenous populations have been put into a situation where they're dealing with many different forces, which they did not cause. And they have to ask some serious questions. Well, how are we going to deal with climate change on top of these things? Are there actions we could take to protect particular vulnerable communities? And these might look different. This might include things that initially don't look at all like climate change. They might include things like dealing with homelessness. It might include things like dealing with mental health crises. It might look like things like dealing with economic revitalization so that people actually have a greater variety of economic resources. Initially, they don't look like climate issues. But if what we're really interested in is tackling underlying vulnerabilities, that opens up a whole bunch of possibilities for thinking differently about how to learn from different communities and what different communities say they themselves need in order to become more resilient. So here is an opportunity for those of you who initially don't think that climate change has anything to do with what you do, to ask yourself, how does what I do intersect with the inequalities we have in our communities, and how could I work towards dealing with those inequalities so that everybody doesn't have to deal with the worst aspects of climate change? So before we go, I want to just think about our ways forward. This is an image of a braided river, and I love braided rivers. Braided rivers are amazing because they're constantly shifting, the pathways are always moving, and there's many different ways for water to get from A to B. And I encourage each of you to think about what tributary you are in this space. What specific skills, networks, interests do you bring to this larger conversation? And how are you going to fit yourself into the myriad ways of how climate change is going to affect our societies? And some of those things initially are not going to look like they're about the environment or about climate change, but are really about personal, collective, and national health, including public health. With that, I'm going to stop because I know we're short on time and open it up to any questions.
Thank you very much, Sonia. Wonderful. I haven't seen any specific questions come through the chat, but lots of great conversation, particularly around the health equity, the housing and homelessness pieces that you addressed. I'll just leave the floor open, the chat open for another minute to just see if there are any specific questions others have, but certainly lots of links being included. And I know we do have a presentation this afternoon that's going to focus on health equity as part of the work of the Poverty Task Force locally. So that will be a good supplement to what you've shared already.
I do see a question here about the pandemic in this context. Do you want me to address this now briefly?
Sure.
So I think the pandemic is a really interesting situation. So one thing we've learned from the pandemic is that absolutely pre-existing inequalities matter, and they matter a lot. And so we've seen this at all levels of the situation, that one of the most important factors in terms of shaping that has been pre-existing inequalities, exposure, economic vulnerability. Another really interesting element here is from this particular pandemic is because it has such implications on lung function. We are seeing increased numbers, especially in the states, of people who are African American. And quite often there is a systemic sort of statistically significant implication here with air quality. Why? Because of a history of systemic racism in the United States, such that African Americans tend to be in the most polluted parts of cities. And so you already have damaged lung capacity. And then COVID comes along, you have a double layer where many of those people are also in high risk professions. And you have a situation where a systemic racial inequality, which at first looks irrelevant to either climate change or the pandemic, actually you have a sustained accumulated health cost because of damage to lungs, because of systemic racism, plus which kinds of employment people have. So this is a key example of how these multidimensional vulnerabilities actually manifest in this situation. The other really interesting element of the COVID pandemic is also a question about how we've responded. So many of the things that people in the climate community have been calling for years suddenly happened in the pandemic. So we suddenly had a much broader attention to, oh wow, we can actually do a lot of things virtually. We don't actually have to fly. Oh, we can actually have conversations about thinking about how to live well more locally. We don't actually have to fly across the world all the time. Oh, we can actually put significant government resources into changing structures when we really need to. We were always told we couldn't do that. Oh, that's interesting. So one of the other elements of the pandemic is I invite us to think about how our psychology works when faced with crises. And one of the elements of this is that When faced with a crisis that might affect us as individuals, we act in very different ways to potentially an even larger crisis, which is going to affect people who might not be our immediate selves, but also have value, i.e. anyone who's younger than us, who's going to be living in this planet. So I do think those are some really interesting elements. There's also all kinds of stuff happening around green recovery and COVID in terms of saying, okay, so we've lost some industries here. How could we think about using and benefiting from these people who now have are interested in new opportunities? Could we connect? So there are some opportunities there as well, but I don't want to take forever. I do see a couple of other questions. The transgenerational equity. So here's a concrete proposal. I don't know if we have any council people on this call. I would invite every single local council to appoint an ombudsman for the future. Something that the Welsh government did was actually have a commissioner for future generations. This is someone whose job it is to look at every single piece of legislation and ask, are we considering the future? One of the ongoing problems we have for young people and the future is that they do not have a voice. They do not vote, and for those who are not yet born, they do not yet exist. They exist only in our imaginations. So one of the concrete things that anyone on this call who's involved in any formal organization could do is appoint someone whose job it is to always bring up the question, wait a minute, are we thinking about this for people who are not yet in the room? What would this look like? What are the long-term implications of this? Have we modeled this in thinking about climate change? Often these issues bury themselves in the technicalities. How many municipalities do more than a 20-year lookout? Let's look further. Let's run this model 100 years out. Let's think about different scenarios. Have we brought in future climate scenarios into this decision about where we're going to put this road or where we're going to put this bridge? This is one of them. It's so pragmatic. And once you have someone in the room whose single job it is to bring this up, it absolutely changes the conversation. So that's a very concrete change, which actually shifts how we imagine things. And there's nothing more powerful than how we imagine things. That is the single most powerful thing we have. So I would offer with that as something for you all to puzzle over.
One final question, Sonia. Any ideas on economic ways that do not rely on tourism and retirees in the South Georgian Bay area for the new future?
I'm afraid I am not the most qualified person to answer that question because although I live here, I only live here part of the ways. So I think that would be a conversation. Honestly, this is for other people who know this area way, way better. I would love to know the answer too, but although I'm from here, I don't feel like I have the qualifications to speak from here because I have been living abroad now for about 20 years. So I don't think I'm the right person to answer that question. So I'm going to send that back to all of you who actually do live here all the time to think that through. And if people have ideas and they would like, or if they would like ideas about what other regions are doing, that is where I could also speak. So I'm also happy to talk to people offline if people say, hey, I thought about this. Is anyone else doing this? That I can actually help with.
All right, Sonia, thank you so much for joining us today. I know you've had a very busy few weeks with work and family and other commitments, so we definitely appreciate you taking some time to speak to us today.